they want an internal response or a production response, and I would always respond with production. And that causes a lot of confusion. Then for the no and not applicable, make sure that they have comments associated with it so that you can get a better feel for what it is that they're trying to tell you. Now, Jericho Forum came up with assessment. This is a self-assessment that they introduced, I think, in March. And this allows for service provider to rate themselves on whether or not they meet some of the security control objectives. The idea behind here is that you can post this Jericho self-assessment on Jericho's website. And if that service provider has a lot of customers that look at that and say, no, that's all wrong, that's not true, they can either go back to Jericho Forum or go back directly to the service provider and tell them to correct it. Now, the only reason why I brought this up is that this is interesting. This is one of the first steps that we're seeing out there. And a lot of other associations are trying to figure out ways to come up with continuous assessment for service providers. This is one of the first ones. I'm not saying that this is the right one. It might be. Maybe later down the road they'll change this to make it look like something else that a lot more people would accept it. So there are other options that you can use to gain more trust on the cloud provider, such as continuing to use your own questionnaires. Now, what I've noticed in my past 10 years running a service provider or working in a service provider, the only time that I receive a questionnaire is the first time a customer is interested in using our service. For the most part, not a lot of companies come back and say, we need for you to update that questionnaire. It's very, very rare that I see a lot of customers do that. The on-site review. If a customer wants to do an on-site review, similar to the questionnaire, they only do it once. It's very rare that I see companies come out and do another on-site review. And if they do, it's usually done once a year. There's the ISO 2700, another certification that you can go for, but it's done, again, maybe once a year. The SAS 70 Type 2. Now, SAS 70 Type 2, I'm sure everybody has heard. There's different or mixed emotions about this. A SAS 70 Type 2 was really meant to evaluate the process of a company. It wasn't really meant to drive down to the technical side of the security practice, and I think that's one of the drawbacks. But the other one is that the service provider can control what it is that can be written into the report. Some companies, like one company I used to work for, what we decided to do was we took all of the control objectives from ISO 17799, put it in the SAS 70, and then asked our third party to audit us against those controls. And then they would report on that, which I felt was a fairly strong report that we can give to our customers. And a lot of our customers relied on that. There's also the international version of SAS 70, the ISAE 3402 that just came out too. There's also SysTrust. SysTrust is just a seal that resides on your web page, and there's 5 different principles. One of them is security. It doesn't give a report. It just says, here are the controls that they're supposed to adhere to, and they pass. PCI, if they're a service provider level 1, posted on Visa, MasterCard site, that might give you a better idea of what control objectives might be placed in that company. Doesn't mean that it's actually in place. Third-party pen test is another interesting one. If they provide a report on this, great. Now, what I would like to see in the report is not just a network pen test, but also a NAPSEC pen test, an assisted source code pen test, and a review against what they believe to be is good, bad, or indifferent. And the last thing I also want to note here is emerging cloud certification and assessments. Earlier this week, Dov and Chris talked a little about this as well. CSA is moving towards figuring out how we're going to be able to standardize on certification and assessments in the service provider. We've reached out to Shared Assessments. I believe there's a meeting coming up with Bank of America to talk about that. There's also another association called the Common Assurance Maturity Model based out in Europe. They had their 6th or 7th meeting so far, and they're looking to do the same thing. The Common Assurance Maturity Model is working with CSA as well as Shared Assessment. And what I'm hoping that'll come out of this, by having all 3 of those or 4 of those associations working together, that a standard will come out on how to perform a review, how to perform an assessment, and how to perform a certification for those service providers. The other thing I want to leave you with on this slide is I wouldn't rely on just one item off of here to get that comfort of a service provider. I would rely on multiple of these items. There's just no way that I'm going to say, okay, I trust your SAS 70 Type 2 and not do a pen test, for example. because there's a lot of areas that's not covered in a SAS 70 that may be covered in some of these other reports. So moving forward, where do I think that we're going to be headed? Well, service provider security is going to continue to mature. And the reason why it's going to mature is that a lot more users are going to come out there and demand or put in requirements that the service provider need to have in place so that the users feel a lot more comfortable using their service. Continuous assessment is the one item that I think we really need out there. And the reason why I say continuous assessment is that there's a lot of controls that companies need to implement. For example, 90-day password change, rotation, reviewing your logs weekly, reviewing your firewall rules, and just going down the list. A lot of that happen either weekly, monthly, quarterly, but we don't see that. The only time we see that is in that annual review that they give back to us. So if there's a vendor, a process, or a new guide that would allow service provider to do that, that would really help, and I think it would lead more towards transparency. Philippe Courteau, our CEO at Qualys, mentioned this a number of different times in his presentation. And one of the reasons why I enjoy working at Qualys, because he sees that there's not one security vendor out there today that can be the end-all, be-all of security for companies. There's just no way. We're going to have vendor cooperation. There's going to be some integration between vendors that may be competing in certain markets. But the only way to provide a good protection for a lot of our customers, or better protection for our customers, is to look for that cooperation and potential integration. The other things he also mentioned was tight collaboration with other vendors, with other service providers, cloud users, and also community. There's going to be a lot more communities similar to that of the Cloud Security Alliance, the ENISA, Jericho Forum, the CAMs, that are going to work together to help provide information to security folks or auditors or CIOs, and the list goes on. So the last slide I have here is just a list of links if you're interested to look into this, and feel free to ask me any questions about any one of these. So I'll leave it here and open up to any questions.
You have covered a very broad range of service providers in your characterization of cloud, ranging from small folks where you might have some leverage all the way up to Google, Amazon. I've read the SLA from Amazon for itself. Just put it up, and please put Google's up. We have no leverage with those folks. It's your data is your responsibility, then the state. I'm not sure what point we can make by sending them a questionnaire.
No, they won't accept the questionnaire.
Right.
So Google will not accept the questionnaire.
And with regard to Amazon, if you either start a vendor, they will just shut you down, and then that's something.
Yeah.
So I guess, there's a level of provider, because I'm actually doing one right now for a learning management system, that I really wouldn't consider a cloud provider. It's really just a software as a service host. And we had some leverage with them. We received it. SAS 7, we come visit your data center. We asked for some backup and hot backup and disaster recovery, but I don't really think of those people as cloud providers. So, we've obviously chosen this broad definition for a reason.
Yeah, so early on in the slide, I mentioned the three different models. And the top model is software as a service on the public side. And I shared that that's what my focus is going to be on in this presentation. So my focus is, my career has been all focused on software as a service on the public side. And what it takes to implement controls for our customers and satisfy their needs to use our service. So I do understand that there's a lot of companies out there, Google definitely one of them, that don't want to share their information. And I think going back to where it was at in 2000, when a user wanted to use a cloud service, there wasn't a lot of other competitors out there. They just had to accept the fact that the company will not do certain things for you if you wanted or requesting for